Hello again, everybody, from the campus of St. Bonaventure High School. This is the OLA Adult Dad Faith Formation weekly 15-minute or so podcast where we take a look at the Sunday Gospel reading and we kind of unpack it so we have a better appreciation of, or better understanding of and appreciation for God's Word when we hear it proclaimed. This is episode 69, believe it or not, and this Sunday we'll be in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12. This is, as I kind of alerted you to last time, this is a Sunday where the church has an option to do a longer or a shorter reading, and you know me well enough that you know I'm going to do the longer reading, but the longer reading is not all that long. It's Mark 12, verses 38 to 44, so really only about 6 verses. The shorter option is Mark 12, verses 41 to 44. So it's only a difference of 3 verses. The longer one is only 6 verses total. So we're going to do the longer one, Mark 12, 38 to 44. And this passage has been traditionally called the widow's mite. So let's kind of orient ourselves as far as where we are in Jesus' public ministry at this time and where he is location-wise. Well, we are now in Holy Week. Mark starts his recording of Holy Week in chapter 11, this being chapter 12. He starts his recording of Holy Week in chapter 11, and the rest of his gospel from there, from chapter 11 to 16, all the way through Holy Week up to and including Easter Sunday. So this being chapter 12, that locates us in Holy Week, and we're in the kind of the beginning part of Holy Week. And Jesus and his disciples and a crowd is in the temple area. So that's the time context and that's the location context. And let's start out by kind of going over what Jesus is talking about here, okay? Because in the temple area, there's an area called the treasury. And that would be a space in the temple area where along the walls you had a number of collection baskets. And these collection baskets were made of metal, and they were kind of in the shape of a funnel. So you would put your, whatever you wanted to donate, you'd put it into this kind of a collection basket that's configured as a kind of a funnel, and it'll go down, and the money will be collected. And there were a number of these, and each one was dedicated to a certain cause. So one collection basket would be for maintenance of the temple. Another collection basket would be offerings for the poor, etc., etc., etc. And these, like I mentioned, these collection baskets, these funnels, were metal, and people would put coins in them. So when a person would drop their coins into any one of these collection baskets, they would make a noise, all right? So that's a little bit of background that Jesus is going to be teaching from. Now, let's get into the actual passage itself, okay? Now, Jesus is just talking to his disciples and the crowd, telling them not to be like the scribes and Pharisees, because they wear long robes. They like very honoring titles. They like to be recognized in the marketplace. They like to be put on pedestals. They like the prime seats in the synagogues. And then he says they like to devour widows' houses. And that's where we want to start kind of our unpacking of this particular passage, because again, this passage centers around a poor widow. And Jesus has just taught the disciples and the scribes in this temple area, in this treasury area, not to be like the scribes and Pharisees. He gives them a number of different reasons, and that he ends with, because they devour the houses of widows, okay? Now, what does Jesus mean when he says the scribes and the Pharisees devour the houses of widows? Well, if you were a widow, remember this is first century, if you were a widow, women didn't work, okay? They didn't have careers. They relied on their husbands for their living. And if the husband were to die, then they would have to rely on their son or their sons for a living. If they didn't have any son or sons, or if they died, widows were basically destitute. Okay? At that point, they either had to resort to begging or worse yet, to prostitution. Okay? So to be a widow in the first century would be to put you in a very precarious financial situation. Okay? Well, what these scribes and Pharisees would do is they would go up to these widows, okay, as financially strapped as they were, and they would convince these widows that the most honorable, the most pious, the most holy, the best thing they could do with whatever money they had left was to donate that money to the particular scribe or the Pharisee so he could then carry out his function of, bringing the religion to the people. Okay? So they would sweet talk these widows into donating what little money they had to them under the guise of, this will help me do my job as a scribe or a Pharisee, when in point of fact, they just pocketed the money. So when Jesus says they devour the houses of widows, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about these the scribes and Pharisees talking the widows out of the little money they had to donate to themselves, okay? Basically bankrupting the widow and pocketing the money, okay? Now, that's what these scribes and Pharisees were doing to widows. Now, just as he finishes this teaching, right on cue, and there's no coincidences, right? A widow comes in to the temple area and to the treasure area to make an offering, to make a donation, right? And she's a poor widow. And she gives, it's called the widow's mite. But what she does is she puts in a couple of copper coins. Now, the actual names for these coins were leptos. That's the Greek name for them. So she puts in a couple of leptos, a couple of these copper coins. They are the equivalent of 1/28 of a denarius. Now, a denarius was a day's wage for a common laborer, okay? So the 2 coins she put in were the equivalent of 1/28 of a day's wage, okay? In other words, it wasn't a whole lot. And we find out in this passage, not only wasn't it a whole lot of money, it was basically just about the last money this widow had, okay? So she takes the last of the little money she has left, and she goes to the temple and makes an offering. And Jesus is watching her do this. And as we say in education, this is another one of those teachable moments for Jesus. Because he's just told his disciples in the crowd, don't be like the Pharisees, because they devour widows' houses. They basically, steal from widows. And then he says, don't be like them, rather be like this widow, okay? Because even the people coming in here and donating large amounts of money, okay, they're donating from their surplus. This widow is donating from her poverty, okay? She's giving the last of what she has, okay? They're giving extra, surplus. She's giving, in essence, everything. All right, so he puts before him a very sharp contrast between what not to do and what to do, who not to be like and who to be like. Now, it's very interesting. Let me hit the pause button for a second here. It's interesting because if you remember back to last week's gospel, Jesus was answering he was saying he was answering the question, what is the greatest commandment? And Jesus said, love God with your whole heart, your whole mind, your whole soul, etc., and love your neighbor as yourself. Love God with your whole heart, whole soul, whole mind, emphasis on the word whole. This widow, in offering the last of what she has, is a visual illustration of that. She embodies what Jesus just taught in the last week's gospel. How? One of the ways you can, loving God with the whole of yourself. Because she gave from her poverty. She gave the rest of her entire living to God. Not surplus, not extra. She gave what she had, all of what she had, to God in this offering. So she was an embodiment, a physical illustration of the wholeness Jesus was talking about when he said, love God with your whole, and then mind, heart, soul, strength, etc. Okay? So no coincidence here that this gospel reading serves as a visual, physical embodiment in this widow of last gospel reading. Okay? Now, interesting here is that the other thing he mentions, okay, is, does the temple need her last 2 copper coins? Is that going to make or break the financial health of the temple? No. The temple didn't need her coins, okay? Yet she gave them anyway because she is giving them ultimately to God. Through the temple, yes, but she's giving ultimately to God, okay? Now, I mentioned in previous podcasts that when the church puts together the readings for any particular Sunday, the first reading, the Old Testament reading, always connects up somehow, some way, to some degree with the gospel reading. So it's no coincidence this Sunday when you hear the first reading from the Old Testament before you hear the gospel, the connection will be readily apparent. Because in the Old Testament reading, the first reading this Sunday, you have Elijah encountering another widow. And his encounter with that widow foreshadows and prefigures, as the old does to the new, Jesus' encounter with this widow. Okay? So as you're hearing the readings proclaimed this Sunday, always see if you can see the connection between the first reading and the gospel. But in this particular case, it's really, really apparent. Elijah and his widow, Jesus and his widow, so to speak. So that's, again, in the time allotment we have, that's Mark 12, verses 38 to 44, the widow's mite. The takeaway, she embodies what it means to love God with the wholeness of your being, okay? Because she was giving out of her poverty, whereas everybody else was giving out of their surplus, and the scribes and Pharisees, worse yet, were basically talking widows out of their money so they could profit for them from it. So with that, Max, how are we doing on the counter here? We are right at 15 minutes. So with that, I'll close. Thank you again for watching these weekly gospel podcasts. And as always, have a blessed Sunday, a blessed rest of the week. And until next week, episode 70, this is Charles Merritt in front of the camera, Max behind the camera, saying take care, everybody.